Sorry. Thank you. First of all, I would like to apologize for the absence of my co-author, Antonios Nestoras, who is at the ALDE party conference in London. He, in a way, is the one who got me interested in parties and elections in Eastern Europe, in post-Soviet countries. Part of it is because he works for Euronest, which is the Inter-Parliamentary Assembly bringing together members of European Parliament and members of national parliaments from countries of Eastern Europe. The other part of the research, which concerns the activity of Europarties, has to do with the fact that both me and him he still has, I had an experience working for Europarties. So we thought it might be interesting to combine the two. So when the program first came up, when I saw the titles of the panel, my first reaction was, I'm in trouble because I have nothing to say about the economic crisis. But lucky me, I'm presenting today this paper while over the last 2 weeks there is a persistent sense of crisis in Eastern European countries. You can see here there's pro-European rallies in Ukraine. There's anti-European rallies in Moldova. The reason is that as we speak, the Eastern Partnership Summit takes place in Vilnius. And the Eastern Partnership is a regional instrument of the EU that brings together the EU with 6 post-Soviet countries. Part of the summit was supposed to be that these states would sign deep association agreements with the EU. And these agreements have been very contested. And the reason is this shows that these states still suffer from a severe crisis of state and national identities, and a crisis of international orientation. Quite simply put, are they going to go with Europe, or are they going to stay much more attached to Russia? What we were also interested in doing was to study party politics in a little studied region, mostly because we didn't want to study party politics again as party politics of post-Soviet states and talk about semi-authoritarianism and corruption and all these things, but talk about party politics in these countries in connection to Europe. So how do they relate to Europe? And finally, we're also interested in transnational party cooperation because we believe it has been underestimated how important it is as a link between Europe and national politics. So, some theoretical propositions, Ilke is going to talk much more about it later, but following from Peter Mayer's famous article about the limited impact of Europe on national party systems, and he made distinction, of course, on the impact on format and mechanics. We wanted to have test some things that did not feature prominently in this article. Mayer talked about the impact of European party systems when it comes to its format, mostly looking at how Europe has created parties. We are wondering whether Europe, in some cases, has the reverse impact on format, whether it actually decreases the number of important parties, whether it consolidates parties. When it comes to mechanics, Peter Mayer talked both for the creation of a new axis of new dimension of competition, but also about the polarization of existing dimensions of competition because of Europe. And we focus here on polarization, something which received, I think, less interest in the article by Mayer than the creation of a new dimension of competition. So, what do Europarties, the transnational federations of national political parties, do in the EU political system? First of all, they are transnational actors, and as transnational actors, this means that they link supranational with national levels of policy making. Their main function is to bring together like-minded actors from multiple levels of policy making, so both supranational, for example, the European Parliament, but also intergovernmental, for example, the European Council. Their main function is to ease coordination and exchange of information. Because of this, Europarties, as independent actors, have an interest in establishing contacts in as many national arenas as possible. And this also means non-EU member states. It is not very, it's easy to forget, but Europarties are probably the only actor of the EU political system that has so many links with political actors outside of the EU. So we make an argument that about how Europarties matter in national politics, and we assume that we think that maybe there is an inverse relationship between the impact of the Europarties, between the impact of the degree of impact of Europarties and a state's degree of integration in the EU. To say that a party's affiliation with a Europarty has an impact in national party competition in EU member states obviously would be to stretch, would really stretch the argument. This thing is really, really small. However, there has been interesting research on how Europarties affected the programmatic and organizational profile of parties in countries ready to accede into the EU. There seem to be two parallel accession processes. Just like countries were ready to enter into the EU, parties from those countries that wanted to enter Europarties were forced to adopt, to change things in the programs and to change the organizational profile in order to make it into Europarties. If we broaden the circle, I would say that if we go beyond the EU's accession zone, I would say that, Europarties are even more important in countries with no imminent accession process, but where EU is inherently contested. Because Europarty affiliation is a clear signal that parties have a strong stance on Europe. And to the extent that Europe is a contested issue of party competition, this means that Europarty affiliation can have not only party-specific effects, but system-wide effects. Some general characteristics about party systems in the post-Soviet area: they are weakly institutionalized parties, there's a lack of properly structured cleavages, parties are created, destroyed, big volatility according to the needs, sometimes the clearly personal interests of elites connected with political and economic oligarchies. Semi-authoritarian political systems, it means that there are big problems in the way the democratic process works. They're very thin or very shallow or very weak when it comes to the program and organization. And the main line of competition in those party systems is quite simply pro and anti-government, pro and anti-regime. There is very little other line of competition that structures party interaction in party systems in the post-Soviet area. However, the Eastern Partnership is made up of 6 countries. Obviously, Azerbaijan and Belarus are not countries we make sense to talk about because they're almost perfect authoritarian regimes. There's no party competition to talk about. However, out of the 4 that remain, 3, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, have had democratic revolutions. Now, the effect of democratic revolutions is that it changes the nature of party competition. Basically, it makes what would simply be an intra-elite competition between those who have power and those who do not have power, it turns it into a more consequential and consistent competition between post-revolutionary and post-authoritarians. The heirs of the revolution, those who claim revolution, versus the heirs of all the semi-authoritarian regimes. And democracy becomes a stake of competition. What we call in our paper, party competition becomes self-reflective. So it talks about democracy while it takes place within a more or less democratic framework. This table, which of course does not claim to be super, it's not super refined or anything, just shows you how if we look at party competition through the lens of post-revolutionaries versus post-authoritarians, we see that that the situation is more or less stable. There are not very big There's not very much big volatility from election to election, or even more importantly, when one side loses power, it does not collapse, which is what usually was happening with governing parties in the post-Soviet area. This argument holds very, very well for Ukraine, because there the post-revolutionaries have been out of power over the last 4 years, but essentially they still hold. Georgia is a bit of a more mixed case, and I can talk about it later. However, the second thing that is particularly interesting is the fact that even though party competition has become a bit more consistent around the question of democracy, there is also something that makes it even more consistent. And this is the fact that these countries are now closer to Europe than ever before. After the Eastern enlargement and the creation of the Eastern Partnership, these countries, their political system has to talk to Europe, if I may say. And the result of this is that Europe becomes part of competition. It becomes absorbed into the post-revolutionary, post-authoritarian dimension of competition. And this takes place particularly on behalf of post-revolutionary elites, elites that claim to have arisen from democratic revolutions. Post-authoritarians, such as the current president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, or the leader of the opposition in Moldova, of the Communist Party, are not particularly anti-European or pro-Russian as are presented in Western media. They're clearly opportunists who try to play one side of the other. It is the pro-democratic camp that is actually consistently and vocally and intensely pro-European. Therefore, it is on their behalf that Europe, by presented as overlapping with democracy, what the post-revolutionary elites stand for, increases polarization against post-authoritarians in party competition. Another effect is the fact that by making the post-revolutionary line of competition about international orientation of parties, this also means that party competition expresses more consistently important social divisions, geographical divisions, such as the East versus West in Ukraine, religious divisions, or ethnic divisions in Moldova. So the combined effect of democratic revolution some years back and the closeness of Europe makes party competition in Eastern Europe a bit more predictable and a bit more normalized, while of course other problems remain. What Europarties do or can do in Eastern Europe is that they act as important frameworks of conditionality. They vet potential associates. They impact on party competition because usually they encourage cooperation between like-minded parties. So they force them to cooperate programmatically even if their leaders have different personal agendas. They promote programmatic streamlining, and this is particularly important for parties that are to a very large extent created by oligarchs or by political elites. So they allow them to acquire ideological credentials. And we assume that it is by virtue of this activity of Europarties that they have two important effects on party competition. First, by association with a Europarty creates an important advantage for parties in their competition with like-minded parties. Parties that are associated with Europarties are seen as being more serious, more consistent, more ideological. Also, association with Europarties provides more resources in terms of prestige, exposure to international media, photo ops with international leaders, and also resources intellectual resources, for example, in programmatic evolution. The second effect is on the degree of polarization of party competition. And so by associating themselves with Europarties, pro-European parties can signal better what they stand for. And this amplifies our capacities to polarize party competition. So, are you sure? Okay. I have 5 according to my watch. So,
Swiss time.
Sorry?
Swiss time.
Okay, well, let's say 4. Okay,
4 is fine.
So, well, yeah, probably, yeah. So, but if you were late, you should have said that I have less time, not more. So, the regional activity of Europarties. If we see, for what the Europarties have done, the European People's Party is the Europarty that has been the most active in Eastern Partnership countries. And the combined effect of its presence has been to amplify processes of consolidation of the pro-European camp around the party of Yulia Tymoshenko. In Georgia, the European People's Party might be particularly important in doing something that is unprecedented in Georgian politics, which is the survival of a party once it goes into opposition. It has been associated with the United National Movement of Mikhail Saakashvili, which has now entered into, which has now lost power. It is under particular pressure from the government for corruption charges, and the EPP is very active in supporting it, saying that these charges are politically motivated. So its support improves prospects for survival of the UNM in opposition. If anything, it creates an incentive for the UNM to remain united and part of the EPP to enjoy this support. Finally, in Moldova, the EPP has clearly shown that it is a party interested in associating itself with strong parties. It has associated itself with a party that is clearly elite-driven, but only after it managed to become the strongest party of the pro-European camp, despite its very shallow ideological credentials. This is a table that shows the strength of the Tymoshenko party and also the strength of the UNM, which is today the strongest opposition Georgia has ever had. And I will not talk about the liberals, I will finish by talking about the socialists. The importance of the socialists is the fact that they may, their biggest importance in the future might be that they may serve as initiator of reform and normalization of post-authoritarian parties. They already showed an interest back in 2010 in contacting with the post-authoritarian party of the regions, what's called pro-Russian, and they have also had an interest in associating with Georgian Dream, also a post-authoritarian party in Georgia. So this also shows how Europarties can export the patterns of their interaction and their competition into arenas outside of the EU. Well, if I don't have any time, I can just finish. Ah, okay, all right. Well.
I gave you an extra minute.
Oh, thanks. The role of Europarties, to conclude about the role of Europarties in Eastern Partnership countries. Europarties enter those national arenas usually as being allies. They initially contribute to polarization by uniting behind post-revolutionaries. They also contribute to the consolidation of parties, but at the same time, they are also competitors in these arenas because they look for different partners. And to the extent that they can find partners associates in different sides of the post-revolutionary, post-authoritarian divide, or they can find partners within the post-revolutionary divide but contribute to this fragmentation, they can be very consequential for the patterns of competition there. Lastly, they provide resources for the consolidation of parties and corporate identities, so the names of the parties, let's say the shells of the parties, while there's evidence that they have also contributed to the ideological streamlining of what remain essentially elite oligarchic projects. Finally, generally the prospects for party systems in the Eastern Partnership, generally it's too early to tell. The crucial indicator is how strong parties will be once they are in opposition. We have seen that in the Ukraine, this is the case. The opposition, Yulia Tymoshenko, has withstood. In Georgia, there are very, very good chances that the UNM will continue existing in the opposition. On the other hand, competition there remains polarized, and as we see, it has become more and more ideologized. It has went from being simply opposition against the government to being about democracy, post-revolutionaries versus post-authoritarians, and today is an apocalyptic competition about international orientation of these countries, Europeanists versus non-Europeanists. There is evidence of consolidation of partisan labels. Parties remain elite and oligarchic projects, but there is still some programmatic progress by virtue of their association with Europarties. However, there is little organizational progress. They remain elite-driven parties. The next electoral cycles, and these are the years of the next elections in each of these countries, will remain crucial to determine to what extent party systems in these countries are going to remain stable, and to what extent the competition, the partisan competition that exists now, will continue to determine party competition there. Thank you.